board is a globe of the world. As Stephen Jay just said, oh, it's round. Well, not perfectly, but close enough for government work, I would say. And it reads, the Skeptics Society presents the Randi Award, the Skeptic of the Year, in honor of James Randi's commitment to science and critical thinking, to Stephen Jay Gould for 300 consecutive essays, The Iron Horse of Science, 2000.
There you are, Stephen. Almost there.
Wait, one more. Thank you, Randy. Great. The Iron Horse had a better ring to it than the Cal Ripken Jr. of
I'm a Yankee fan anyway.
We were trying to think of what else to give you. Somebody had, a couple of years ago, donated a sizable collection of antiquarian books to the Skeptics Society. Since I skipped out on some of my foreign language requirements for my Ph.D., but you didn't, I thought these might have a slightly better use with you, as well as one additional one in English. So I'll start off with that one. This one in particular is a little delicate. The cover comes off, so you have to be careful with that. But this is Charles Darwin's first edition, 1851, monograph on the fossil Lepidae, which turns out actually it has 2 volumes, and I didn't realize the second.
Indeed, the Verrucadidae and the Balanid.
Yeah, there we go.
The stalk barnacles.
Thank you, because I wasn't going to try to say that. So, so we'll start off with this one.
Well, that's terrific.
That's good, right?
You do know he wrote 4? Well, I'll tell you the story during my lecture.
He'll give you the whole story. Then the second one is the Descent of Man in Italian. It's the first edition, 1888, in Italian by Carlo Darwin. So since you do read some Italian.
Oh, yeah, I can.
Then my favorite one here is, there you go. The favorite one here is Darwin's autobiography it's the first edition in Russian, 1957, right? He reads Russian, yes, it's hard to believe, but he does. So it comes with illustrations pasted in. I guess they didn't have enough glue, in 1950s Russia. But the best part of this is some of these things come with stuff in them, which is sometimes the best part of antiquarian books. This one in particular, on Linnaean Society of London, letterhead, obviously meant for a little bit of satire. So remember, this is from Russia, 1957, and it's signed by Comrade Ivan Mudiov. And it's addressed, this is November 30th, actually 1963. Dear comrades, it's written in red ink, by the way. As the new librarian was going to discard this production of the peace-loving peoples of the Soviet Union, I thought the decadent scientific servants of the imperialistic, warmongering, capitalistic exploiters would be interested in it. Yeah, that's right. Perhaps the library could use a Russian book. Anyway, I hope it's provocative right down to this red ink. So with that.
Oh, that's terrific. Oh, especially the Darwin barnacle. That's fabulous. Yeah.
Okay. Oh. And the Mets won. So there you go.
Oh, that's just a good surprise. Sorry, guys, but hey, you're in Southern California. You don't care about San Francisco, do you? Am I on? You're on. Okay. I need my Yeah, just give me a minute. I'm gonna need this stuff before we finish. Might as well get it all out at the beginning. No, this really is amazing. I must say, that one of the most interesting aspects of Darwin's life and the most revealing is that he developed theory of natural selection in pretty much its complete form, though he didn't have his explanation of divergence, which was very important to him, in 1838, and he didn't publish till 1859, and that's one of the long-standing puzzles in Darwinian scholarship. Why does he delay 21 years? The old heroic explanation that he was just collecting his facts, he didn't want to jump the gun, that simply can't be right because he was doing other things, and the primary proof of that it must have been fear and not just mere collection. I don't think fear of exposing evolution, which is not that heretical a view, but of exposing the radical content of his own take on evolution. The best evidence that indeed his motivation could not simply have been a slow and steady work of collecting his information is that his major activity during those 20 years was to write what remains to this day the classic work on the taxonomy of barnacles, which is in 4 volumes, 2 on the living barnacles, 2 on the fossil barnacles, and it's a great honor. These are not easy to get, to own one of these, so I really thank you all from the bottom of my heart. I am not a sentimental person, as those who know me know perfectly well, but indeed, junior high school friendships are thicker than blood. I like most of my relatives, but as they say, you don't choose them, and you do choose your friends. And Richard was known as Dino, I was known as Fossil Face, and we were the 2 nerds of junior high school '74. The Nathaniel, I'll tell you one story about that. I'm just warming up. It was the Nathaniel Hawthorne Junior High School. It's still there. I actually drove by it the other day. One of the worst faux pas I ever heard made was when our principal stood up and announced that we were going to start school elections, because you have to have mock democracy in high school elections that are absolutely for nothing. And he said that since the name of the school was the Nathaniel Hawthorne Junior High School, the name of the 2 political parties would be the Nats and the Whores. At which point, even in junior high school, we broke out into unutterable laughter, and he quickly recovered and announced that maybe that wasn't right, that it would be the 2 colors of the school, and this was even worse, because this is the mid-1950s, that the 2 parties would be the whites and the reds. Oh, well. Let me begin this with, that's true, I'm not making that up, by the way. Let me begin this with a couple slides which make a point I want to emphasize. These are 2 artworks from the city of Florence. Some of you will have seen me use them before. I guess, do I turn it on? Let me press this and see what happens. You never know. Nothing happens. That's not what you're supposed to do. Let me try it again. Okay, good. This is a painting that hangs in the great cathedral, Santa Maria dei Fiori. And the only important thing is its painter, Michelino, is not well known, but the important thing is it's a 15th century painting. It's pre-Copernican. That's the only point of this. And it's called Dante e il suo poema, Dante and his poem, The Divine Comedy. And what I love about this painting is that it depicts the entire universe of the pre-Copernican world. Here we have Dante standing at the center. To his left is the great dome of Brunelleschi's cathedral. It wasn't built until 150 years after Dante's death or so, but we'll let that pass. Dante was exiled from Florence and died in Ravenna, but everything else is here. Florence stands at the center of the world, but everything else is here. To Dante's right, going down, are the ones who didn't lead so exemplary a life. And above him to the right, slowly mounting the spire of purgatory, are those who are eventually going to be all right. And so here we have everything. Now, what I love most about this, and unfortunately this slide, the only one I could get, doesn't show the complete story, but there are 7 in the original painting, 7 semicircles above the Earth, and they are the 7 planets of the Ptolemaic system. Let's see, what are they? They're Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. That's only 5. What else you can't see? Uranus, Neptune, etc. But of course the answer is the sun and the moon. You have to get yourself back into that system. And then again, if it were complete, you would see that up in the corners are the fixed stars. So there's the entire 15th century universe. Now you take a 10-minute walk in the city of Florence to the Church of Santa Croce, and you find the tomb of Galileo. And everything has changed. Galileo looks out into the heavens, holding in his right hand the telescope with which he had first seen so many wondrous things. His left hand now rests on this insignificant little sphere of the Earth, which was the entire world of the previous Dantean cosmology. And I think that really does capture the paradox of the glory and the fear of scientific knowledge. There's a quote from Freud that I often use, because I think it is so insightful, though he's not, and I agree with Frank here, one of my intellectual heroes by any means. But Freud said that one of the most ironic points about the history of the progress of human knowledge, and particularly of scientific revolutions, is that each of the few truly great scientific revolutions had 2 key properties. First, they reformed our view of the nature of physical reality. Well, of course they do that. You wouldn't call it a revolution if it didn't. And secondly, and this is the paradox, not only did they reform our view of the nature of physical reality, but each of these truly great revolutions, of which there are very few, knock human arrogance off one pedestal after another of our previous beliefs in our own self-importance. Because the way we had constructed physical reality in the beginning was to maximize our sense of our own importance in the universe. So here you have this great paradox that every grand increase of knowledge, which is itself so liberating through science, also has this side effect of enormous fear and demotion for many people. And in Freud's statement, the 2 greatest revolutions were first the one we associate with Copernicus and Galileo and Newton. And secondly, of course, was Charles Darwin's, the one that's our primary focus today. Now, we know the effects of that first revolution. Here's the most famous story that comes out of the history of science, so I think badly mistold in most cases. This is the famous frontispiece of Galileo's Dialogo, for which he was brought before the Inquisition and in 1633 made to forswear his belief in the heretical nature of heliocentrism. Now, I don't have time to go into revisionist history, and I don't want to revise things too much. Galileo remains an intellectual hero, and Maffeo Barberini, Pope Urban VIII, made a really bad move by the proper judgment of later history. But it's really not so simple, and I think to get through this silly paradigm of science versus religion, and there is no versus, we need to understand that even this story was more complex. Of course, Galileo is a martyr. Yes, he did live the rest of his life under the equivalent of house arrest, and it shouldn't have happened. But the point is, he was a horrible hothead. He never should have been in trouble. It was 90% his fault, given the realities of the time. He was allowed to teach this stuff as long as he taught it as a hypothesis and not as a physical reality. All right, it's a little compromise for the time. All he had to do was to write an honest dialogue. The Copernicans still would have come out way ahead because the arguments are so much better. That's all he had to do. He had an imprimatur to print this book. Instead, he writes this dialogue in which the arguments for the Ptolemaion are put in the mouth of a character named Simplicios, whose arguments are as good as his name. And Maffeo Barberini, reading this, got the sneaking suspicion, he may well have been right, that Simplicio was meant to be him, having been Galileo's one-time good buddy. And in any event, let's leave it at that. But I don't mean in any sense to degrade the kind of tension that this and all of these great Freudian scientific revolutions produce. However, this wasn't the big one. You know, the Pope may not have officially exonerated Galileo until recently, but I guarantee you, I think most of us have the false impression that the reason why we accept this one is that, oh, well, it happened so long ago, there was probably as much controversy over Darwin. That's not true. I guarantee you that within 50 years, this was not an issue in Catholic scientific circles. They all knew that the Copernican model was true. They may have been slightly and diplomatically supporting this intermediary tychonic view in which the planets go around the sun, but the sun still goes around the earth. But it was not an issue very quickly. Whereas, and I guess for two reasons. First of all, well, the earth does go around the sun, and it would be difficult to base a theology on the alternate premise, which is so factually false. And secondly, I think the church has always recognized that doctrinal issues are not dependent on the factual state of the world anyway, which is why there never has been a literalist tradition in Catholic thought. But again, we leave that. It was a dead issue in 50 years. Now, on the other hand, the Darwinian revolution, that's the really big one, isn't it? It may not be so much a theme in other Western nations, but here we are 150 years virtually after the origin of species, and we still live in a nation in which half the people or so claim they don't believe it, though many of them are not activists against it in any sense. Now, why should that be so? Why this big difference? Why is Darwin so much harder? I don't mean this totally facetiously or only for laugh, but I think it's right. The Darwinian revolution is much bigger. This one's about real estate. I mean, it really is. I don't mean it doesn't discombobulate, but in terms of what it does to your insides, that second character, the pedestal-smashing character, this one's about real estate. The Darwinian revolution is about essence. It's about who we are. It's about what we're made of. It's about, insofar as science can answer these questions at all, what are we related to? Why are we here? Science only deals with part of that kind of inquiry. When did we get here? What is our status with respect to the earth? The Darwinian one is the big one, and it remains troublesome. I want to talk about mostly tonight why it's troublesome and what I think scientists and people who write about science, the general public, can do about that. Let me illustrate that by showing a bunch of slides. Some of these you've seen before. This is the classic portrait of Darwin, the sage of Down. Darwin's dates are easy to remember. He was born on Lincoln's birthday, or vice versa. I don't mean just the same date, same day, February 12, 1809. Died in 1882. Long, reasonably healthy life, despite his illnesses. Now, there is this mythology that great ideas only come to younger people. I must say, as I enter closer to this status than an earlier one, I come to resent that mythology even more. Nonetheless, I think it is right. you're not going to get the sense, given that urban legend, you're not going to get the sense of Darwin's revolutionary character if this is the picture you have in mind, and it is the picture that most of us have in mind. Here's a better one. I think Frank showed this one earlier. Genial, but at least of the right age for more revolutionary thinking. Here's my favorite, though. This was done by a colleague of mine, Phil Darlington, who wrote how Charles Darwin might have looked as a modern graduate student just back from 5 years of field work. This picture is intended to fix in readers' mind that Darwin was most innovative at this age. This is an important point. Darwin comes back from the Beagle in 1836. He's 26 or 27 years old. By September of 1838, he has effectively all of the theory of natural selection. There's much to be filled in, particularly the explanation of divergence. He's still not 30 years old. This is the revolutionary Darwin. This is the man who made the greatest of the Freudian revolutions. This is the man whose work we're still struggling to comprehend in all its implications. Darwin's life is fascinating, as you all know. He had this great coming-of-age adventure, traveling around the world, but for all the good it did him, and I think Frank brilliantly outlined that today, he was tottering. He'd seen many things that raised questions in his mind, but he was not yet a committed evolutionist when he docked in London in 1836. The real intellectual revolutionary work of Darwin, the real adventure of Darwin, all happens here. Well, in London, where he lived for a while, and in Downhouse, where he lived. You know, Darwin never crossed the English Channel after coming back from the Beagle voyage. He never went anywhere again. He took various trips to various waters to try and achieve various cures for his illnesses, but he did it in his home with voluminous correspondence, carrying out all sorts of experiments on all. I don't mean he did it. He did it as an active member of the scientific community, but he did it here. The great adventure of Darwin's life was here at Down. I don't think it was around the world. And the Beagle, they're part of the same. The most egregious misquotation ever done of any of my works was an article I did on Downhouse for an antiques magazine. And this is the armchair in which Darwin changed the world. This is where he wrote. He sat in this chair. Just as you got to lie on Freud's couch, I actually got to sit in that chair once. A great thrill, and that was the writing board he used, and he wrote his books against that board. I wrote this piece, and I wanted to call it Revolutionary Armchair, because that's what it was. Because they didn't understand that. I never got to see the proofs, and it came out as Armchair Revolutionary, which is exactly the opposite. The last thing he was Armchair Revolutionary. No, that's the Revolutionary Armchair. No, there is no other revolution like Darwin's. It's about essence, it's not about real estate. Many of you have seen this. I just can't come to California and not show this famous slide. I'm sure 90% of the people in the room know the story, but I'll tell it again for the 10% who don't. This is the campus of Stanford University after the 1906 earthquake. It's not a made-up scene. It's the statue of Louis Agassiz, which tumbled during that quake and ended upside down in the pavement there. The reason why this is so wonderfully symbolic is that Louis Agassiz, who opened the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard, where my office resides, opened it in 1859, the same year that Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. Agassiz was the last legitimate scientific creationist. He died in 1874, still committed in a philosophically legitimate way to these beliefs of his earlier life. Now, here's the funny story, which deserves, do you realize that almost all classical stories in the history of science are false? The thing I love about the Huxley story, which one of Richard's wonderful songs is based on, is that apparently that one's true, that Huxley really did say, how extremely stupid not to have thought of it myself when he read the proofs of Darwin's Origin of Species. At least he records that. This story we know is not true because the man about whom it's told actually refuted it in his own autobiography. It had grown to such proportions. But here's the story for what it's worth. The point is this indicating symbolically the revolutionary character of Darwin's work as ancient thought is upended and askew in the pavement of Stanford University. The story is as follows. The president of Stanford University at the time was David Starr Jordan, one of America's great educators, who in his earlier life had been the first great Darwinian ichthyologist in America. That is, he's a student of fishes and an early supporter of Darwin. He had an odd relationship with Agassiz because Agassiz was also an ichthyologist, and Jordan had great respect for Agassiz's technical work in fishes, but rather little respect for Agassiz's stubbornness on the larger scale issues of biology. So the story goes that when Jordan surveyed the damage the next morning on the campus of Stanford, he took one look at this scene and said, oh well, I always thought better of Agassiz in the concrete than in the abstract. He didn't say it. He should have, but he didn't. In an autobiography he wrote late in his life called The Life of a Man, he does actually have a whole section refuting that anecdote, which had already become. He should have said it. There is no revolution like Darwin's for the public notice and controversy. I'm going to show you a series of slides. Some may have seen them before. These are all, I didn't make any of these up, these are all headlines that appeared in the Boston Globe during one calendar year about Darwin. Darwin's theory, yeah, definitely. Darwin, evolution, that's his theory, right? Yeah. Darwin irked by antics. See, poor guy, still people opposing, still getting trouble all the time. Hasn't been fit enough, see? Yeah. Survival of the fittest, but hadn't been fit enough is a theory. Pressure's on Darwin. Oh, those creationists are knocking at the door, aren't they? Darwin's injury appears serious. Oh my God, maybe these intelligent design people have something. Darwin hurt most by poor support. Now you see, you skeptics, you got to get out there and rally behind your heroes. Darwin had some deep problems. Oh boy, that's bad. Birds hang tough loss on Darwin. Yeah, well, you know, that's always been a big problem. It's the old issue of the intermediary stages of useful structures. You know, a bird's wing, it's pretty clear what it's good for, but since 5% of a wing can't possibly aid you in flying, the evolution of the bird's wing has always been a great difficulty ever since Mivart wrote his book Against Darwin in 1871, which elicited the only chapter that Darwin ever added to later editions of The Origin of Species. So yeah, the birds can indeed hang a tough loss on Darwin. If you can't explain that, bad break does in Darwin. It's terrible. But then, that's the nadir, yeah. But then, you know, thrown out. Just terrible. Darwin's theory thrown out. Well, it's a random world. You know, maybe things will come back to shell game. Who knows? Okay, things are getting better. Hey, we have hope. Darwin on the upswing. Darwin takes healthy approach. That's good. Darwin's all-purpose this time. Well, that's what the theory of natural selection is about, right? It's about how you get good design in organisms there. Darwin wins in his return. That's good. Things coming back. That's terrific. Darwin tough again. That's great. Darwin helps fill in another blank. That's what they always say. The fossil record is going to do him in. There are all these gaps in the record, but, you know, we get them once in a while. Darwin a winner after film review. Okay, popular science marches on. Very good. That's a tough one. You'd subdue Chicago, I guess that's pretty good. It's a tough city, tough city. Darwin's alive and well, spotted with Elvis in Las Vegas. Well, I mean, you'll have figured out by now. It's obviously not Charles they're referring to. This is the year that Danny Darwin was a pitcher for the Red Sox. But look, folks, I didn't waste 4 minutes of your time just to get some cheap laughs. What really intrigued me is why I collected these. Oh, I didn't mind the cheap laughs, but no, there's a serious point here. I think you see to what extent Darwinian lingo is. These are sports pages headlines. All right, the Globe's a fairly intellectual newspaper, but still, these are sports pages headlines. Almost every one I showed you had a sly little reference to evolutionary theory, a reference to survival of the fittest, a reference to adaptation. That just shows you how pervasive through our language all this is, and how much, although so many Americans don't want to accept it or don't accept it, that the Darwinian lingo, the Darwinian challenge is so profound that when you get an oddity, a modern picture that happens to bear his name, you're going to get all this. Oh, by the way, can we turn that off for a minute? It has nothing to do with this talk. I'm the only guy who doesn't have a time limit, right? Good. Okay. Doesn't have anything to do with anything, except I wanted to tell you the Casey Stengel story that Lou referred to. Because Casey was such a smart... Could we turn that off? You don't need to look at Danny Darwin. Nice guy, but I just don't need him right now. I want to tell you the Casey Stengel story. Stengel was such a smart guy, and the comment that I was writing about, because the issue was a question of category mistakes, that is, to make an argument about life on this planet, does that allow you to make an inference about the category of all planets or the category of the universe? And we always make errors of that kind. But Stengel, if you listen to him, he was such a brilliant point maker amidst this patter that was known as Stengelese. He was the first manager of the Mets. Now they just won today. As it happens, they're a good team, but you may remember the initial Mets and the hapless first days of expansion. The worst team in history. I think they were 50 and 102 in their first, 50 and 104. Let's play 154-game seasons. And Stengel had to pick people in the expansion draft, but there were no good players available. And he chose, as his first or second pick in the expansion draft, a particularly inept catcher named Hobie Landreth. And when he was criticized by the press, why did he pick such a miserable player in the expansion draft? Hobie Landreth, the catcher. Stengel's comment was just precious. He just looked up at the report. He said, you know, he said, you got to have a catcher. Because if you don't have a catcher, you're likely to have a lot of passed balls. I mean, it's just brilliant. He put aside the whole question, which was a criticism for choosing this nincompoop, by answering it in terms of the category of catchers. I mean, it's a deeply philosophical comment. And I was writing about category mistakes. I respect Alfred Russel Wallace's views on life elsewhere. My comparisons may sometimes be far-fetched, but they're not illogical. To talk about what is so radical in this greatest of all scientific revolutions, the one that's about essence and not real estate, Darwin says in The Descent of Man, but we now know it is called, what's it called? It is called L'origine dell'uomo e la scelta in rapporto col sesso. The origin of man and sex choice in respect to sexual selection. Well, Darwin says in The Descent of Man that, and other places, but most emphatically there, that he tried to do two quite different things in his life as a scientist with respect to evolution, which is the foundation of his work. First, he tried, he says, to convince people simply that evolution had occurred, that it was a factually correct statement about the interrelationships of organisms on this planet, that the basic fact of evolution is fundamentally two propositions, that there is a single tree of life which connects all things genealogically, and that change occurs by descent with modification, to use Darwin's phrase. But, as he said, he had also tried to develop an explanation for the mechanism whereby evolution works, the theory of natural selection. And I think that's a very important distinction. It represents the two fundamental things that science does. On the one side, the attempt to ascertain fact. They're not unrelated, of course. You can't, all observation has to be, the thing I like best about that statement, all observation must be for against some view if it is to be of any service. I don't know of any other great quotation that has 6 words of 2 letters each in a row. If it is to be of any service, and yet it works. But that's a minor point. So I don't mean that fact and theory are totally separable entities, but there are these fundamental activities in science. You need to try and determine the factual state of the universe, how it's set up, and then you have to determine why it's made that way rather than some other conceivable way or theory. You need to establish factuality. You need to propose explanations for why it works that way. And that's the distinction Darwin's making. And the reason he's making it is that he doesn't have that much support for natural selection. But already 12 years after the origin, he has convinced the thinking world about the factuality of evolution. So there's some, in a sense, almost diplomatic or political reason to say that. But it remains an important distinction. And the reason I want to focus on, I don't want to talk much about the factuality of evolution tonight, though I have one comment and one slide. I want to talk about why Darwin's revolution is so difficult because of the nature of his particular theory. Now, what he says after making that distinction is that of those two, merely ascertaining the factuality is the most important one because such a train of consequences follows from that. Merely to acknowledge that we are not created in God's image as an incarnation of his intentions for the highest form of living things on this particular world, merely to see our genealogical connections has so much flowing from it. Fair enough, but I still think that there are many ways we could make our peace with that, and we wouldn't have troubles with it today if Darwin's own take were not so wonderfully radical and so completely, courageously, undauntingly radical, that's what I'm to say. But and I will focus mostly on that. But on the issue of factuality, let me just show you one slide. It's a very poignant story. I'll use this as a surrogate, because I'm not going to talk about the mere factuality of evolution, for why it's so important to know the factuality of evolution, what terrible mistakes one can make in the most practical way if you don't. This is my favorite of all stories on this, and it's fairly local. So let's have that back. This is the tomb of baby Faye. You will probably remember the case, she of the orangutan heart, this young baby who had a heart that would not have sustained her, and she would have died within days. And Dr. Bailey tried to sustain her by using the heart of a baboon, which was rejected immunologically, and baby Faye died. I just find it so touching that the grave should have the double heart. But here's the story. And I don't want to exaggerate. Dr. Bailey, I'm sure, is a most humane man and a wonderful doctor, and I doubt this child could have been saved in any possible way, and he surely tried his best. But a question does come up. It's really an interesting one, and did come up. It's not a conjectural issue. If you're going to do it at all, and I accept there are grave ethical questions about whether it should be done at all. I'm not going to address those. They need to be addressed. Should you sacrifice a primate at all for something that's probably isn't going to work? Anyway, but putting that aside, once you've made the decision that you're going to try it, why did he use a baboon and not a chimp? It's indefensible. Immunological rejection is an issue of phylogenetic distance. The phyletic distance between Homo sapiens and baboon is, I don't know, it's 30 to 40 million years. Don, do you know what it is? Yeah, it's really long. The phylogenetic distance between chimp and human is 6 to 8 million years. We're not talking about a small difference. We're talking about a major difference of immense meaning with respect to what he's trying to do. Now, again, I don't think the chimp heart would have worked either. Now, you can say, as Bailey did, that, well, the baboon heart fits. It's the right size. But the baby chimp heart does too. The adult one wasn't. So he was asked that question. And why did you use the baboon heart and not the chimp? And his first answer was functional. It was purely functional. He said, I think he knew he had to use a primate. It had to be close, okay, in some sense of relationship. But he said, I used a baboon because it was the right size. It was functionally, and it was more available than a chimpanzee. And then, bless her, the reporter pushed him and said, but Dr. Bailey, the issue is immunological rejection. There's this enormous difference between the chimp and baboon. I accept what you say functionally about the baboon heart being perhaps a better size, but so would a baby chimp heart be. Why did you not give this child its best chance? Because by evolutionary arguments, clearly the chimp is, half an order of magnitude closer. It's not even a close call. And Bailey gave this very embarrassed response. He looked up and he said, well, you see, I don't believe in evolution. He's a Seventh-day Adventist doctor from Loma Linda Hospital. And there are reasons of life and death where sometimes the factuality of evolution is very important to understand, and I will leave it at that. And let's turn that off because we certainly don't need to stare at the tomb of poor baby Faye as I go on. So I just say that en passant on the issue of the factuality of evolution. Let me get to the other level of, and could I have some more lights? I love to see my audience, and I'm not going to have another slide for the next 15 minutes or so, or at least 10. So thank you. Let's get on to the second characteristic of Darwin's great revolution, the theory. Why is it, what's he afraid of, to go back to that issue? Develops theory in 1838, writes out sketches 1842 and 1844, wouldn't have published it until the mid-1860s if the Wallace incident hadn't come along. Why the delay? If he was just collecting his facts, sure, but when you spend 8 years to write four volumes on the taxonomy of barnacles, I think that's displacement activity, folks. He was afraid of something. Now, what was he afraid of? You might think, well, he was afraid to expose his belief in evolution, but that can't be right. Darwin didn't invent evolution. When I used to start lecturing on this topic 30 years ago, my line used to be evolution was the most common heresy of mid-19th century biology, but that's not right either. Evolution was the most common mild unorthodoxy, maybe a little more than mild. You didn't get in trouble. He was not fearful of exposing his beliefs in evolution. For example, in the year 1800, Center of Natural History Studies, Paris, the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, there are three great professors, there are many, but the three greatest professors there, Lamarck, Cuvier, and Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire. Two of them are evolutionists. In the first decade of the 19th century, Geoffroy and Lamarck, only Cuvier is adamantly not. You know, when two of the three greatest professors at the world's leading institution are pro-evolution, this is not an unspeakable kind of heresy. Clearly, to make a long argument very short, Darwin was afraid of exposing something, and it was not, clearly, his simple approbation of a hypothesis of descent with modification. It's a longer argument, but I think the evidence is pretty clear that Darwin was well aware of the philosophically radical characteristics of his particular take on evolution, and that's what he was afraid of exposing to the world. You know, there are many user-friendly versions of evolutionary theory. They're not at all like Darwin's. Many people held they were more popular in the 19th century before the modern synthesis of this century made the Darwinian mechanism canonical for the first time, and that wasn't until the 1930s or 40s of the last century. But there are many user-friendly views. You can believe that evolution is God's way, that there's a direct Godward path that is ordained by the hand of the Creator, or you can believe that God established laws like natural selection so that the preordained result of inherent progress leading inevitably to humans would unroll in its appointed fashion, and that was a very common belief among 19th century evolutionists. So it's not as though evolution itself, it's going to be disturbing in its mere factuality, as Darwin notes, but there are takes on theoretical constructions that could lead to much greater acceptability in 19th century, and to that extent current context as well. And Darwin does not do that. The beauty of Darwin's theory, and why we're still fighting with it today, and this is the heart of what I want to talk about, is that the theory of natural selection is just so radical with respect to the standard traditions of thinking in Western philosophy, of our psychological hopes, of our sociological comforts. And Darwin, this Whig in politics, this social conservative in lifestyle, not in belief, but this philosophical radical at the core of his being, loved all this at the same time as it distressed other parts of his being. That's too simple, of course, to say that there's an external Darwin, the upper-class social conservative, there's the political Darwin, the Whig liberal, and there's the internal Darwin, the philosophical revolutionary, because it leads to a silly myth that somehow the real Darwin is the internal philosophical radical and the rest is just for show. That's nonsense. What you show to the world is as much you as what's lurking on the inside of you. Darwin's just a complex man with many things tugging at him, some of which are contradictory, that never resolves in his life. I don't think because he's philosophically radical at some internal core that that's more deeply and intrinsically him than the social conservative who's holding court it down. They're just all part of this wonderful man. I don't know what else you can say, but it is to the internal philosophical radical that I wish to appeal to. I'll make 3 points, issues that are still so difficult for people to accept today. Such a radical theory breaks through all the comforts of Western thinking. You know, I wasn't going to tell this story, but it's quick. Why do we even call it evolution? Darwin never used that word. The word evolution doesn't appear in the first edition of The Origin of Species because, in short, evolution means progress. It was a vernacular English word at the time, not a particularly common one, mostly poetic, but it comes from the Latin evolutio, which means unfolding. And evolution in vernacular English meant inherently progressive unfolding of some preordained sequence. Darwin never would have called his process that because he developed this incredibly radical theory of a naturalistic mechanism that he called natural selection, which yielded only local adaptation. The parasite that becomes so morphologically simplified that it's nothing more than a bag of reproductive tissues in the interior of its host is no less well adapted than complex us are to our exteriors, and we probably each have a reasonably equal chance of extended geological persistence. That's what the theory is about. Now, again, Darwin's complexities. He's an eminent Victorian. Lytton Strachey didn't happen to write about him, but he could have in that great book. He manages to smuggle progress back in through an ecological argument about how full the world is and the nature of competition, but he understands perfectly well that the bare bones mechanics of natural selection is not about progress. It's only about local adaptation. The most you can say, if you want to imply a vernacular term like progress, is that when it gets cold, the elephant that through natural selection develops a coat of hair and becomes a woolly mammoth, yeah, it's improved in its local environment, but it's not a better elephant in some cosmic sense. That's all Darwinism's about. So he's not going to call it evolution. Why would he take a vernacular English word that meant progress for this other kind of, he calls it descent with modification. Eventually, he gave up. The world around him called it evolution. Largely, it's, again, not a simple issue, but largely because Herbert Spencer, the great Victorian pundit of nearly everything, who thought, as did most people in the time, that progress was an inherent, well, not so much inherent, it's a necessary outcome of the way in which structures interact with environments, but Spencer, who had written a famous essay in 1850 called Universal Progress, Its Law and Cause, and who saw all natural processes as almost necessarily, or at least predictably, progressive, he called them all evolution. He used the vernacular English word. That was the viewpoint that most of Darwin's contemporaries embraced, because it was the only way they could take it into their hearts on the notion of essence. They could only take it in as a progressive accounting, which validated belated human presence at least broadly predictable, if not directly ordained. And so they called it evolution, as did Spencer. Darwin wasn't going to fight that one because it was just linguistic usage. And by the 6th edition of the Origin and in The Descent of Man, he eventually uses the word evolution. But it's an interesting story. He understands it perfectly well. Now, I'm going to talk about 3 things. First, the radical character of Darwin's theory. Secondly, what I say about variation. And thirdly, the issue of historicity, which to me are the 3 great radical implications of Darwinian theory, not merely the factuality of evolution. There's always more friendly ways to spin the pure factuality. This is what you can't escape from the heart of Darwinian theory. With respect to its radical character, if I were asked to characterize, and if I had more time, I'd tell you a long story about Darwin Fitzroy, which is the hat I like to hang this particular tale on, but I don't. I would simply say this: the standard view of the relationship of nature to God, as Darwin is a young man, as reflected in volumes going back to the heart of the scientific revolution, volumes by John Ray and Boyle in Newton's Generation, through Paley's Natural Theology, through the Bridgewater Treatises, which Darwin's buddies called the Bilgewater Treatises, not that everybody liked them, is the central argument of natural theology, which, again, in a too simplified a view, states that God's existence, and not only his existence, but also his attributes of goodness and benevolence and omnipotence, all can be seen from the nature of nature. And 2 things in particular: the good design of organisms and the harmony of ecosystems. That's the meaning of Paley's famous metaphor. You know how Paley's natural theology begins. Paley says, if I'm walking along on a heath and I kick my foot against a stone and I pick it up, I can't infer anything about the manufacture of the stone from its characteristics because it's too messy. He didn't know about crystal structure. But if I kick my foot against a watch and I pick it up, and I'd never seen one before, if I made a right analysis even of this Casio, $15, when it breaks, throw it out and get a new one. McCready wouldn't like that, but that is what I do. But Paley's argument is that, sorry, Paul. But Paley's argument is 2 things about this watch. First of all, I would see that it was enormously complex, made of hundreds of, not this one, made of hundreds of interacting parts, but not just complex, but all interacting for one purpose, to tell time. I would therefore know there has to have been a watchmaker. That kind of complexity can't arise by random processes. That kind of complexity can't arise by any physical processes without inherent purpose placed therein. Therefore, the existence of the watch implies a watchmaker. Now, organisms are much more complex and equally well designed as watches. So if the watch implies a watchmaker, then organisms imply a maker of an even grander sort, and you can infer God's existence and his attributes of goodness, perfection, and benevolence. Now, suppose, just as an abstract argument, I'm not going to go into it all, the psychology of why Darwin wants to do it. Just suppose you want to overthrow that argument in the most radical possible way. Mind you, you can have a user-friendly evolutionary theory that's still going to incarnate Paley's precepts. You can have God working through natural selection, do the same things. Becoming an evolutionist is a radical step. It doesn't force you to abandon all this stuff. But suppose you just want to make the most radical transition. Well, I can imagine 2 arguments. One argument would simply be to deny the phenomenology. Hey, you say organisms are well designed and ecosystems are harmonious, but they're often very badly designed. And horrible things go on out there, if you interpret them, as you shouldn't, by the way, from a human moral point of view. So the ichneumoniid wasp lays its egg in the paralyzed body of a caterpillar. The larva emerges, eats the caterpillar, still alive though paralyzed from inside, but carefully, saving the heart and nervous system for last so it doesn't kill its prey. Now, how are you going to read that, though it may be a good adaptation for the wasp in human moral terms? Now, that's a pretty, in other words, the reason why that's a radical argument is, hey, if God made that kind of world, maybe you ought to rethink it. Is that the kind of God you want? The God of love and care for you. Now, that's a pretty radical argument, but that's not the argument that Darwin used. Darwin did critique it to some extent. There isn't perfection out there, but for the most part, Darwin accepted the Palean observations. Organisms are well-designed, ecosystems are harmonious. I'll give you a more radical argument, he says. This is a reconstruction. I'm not saying he thought of it quite this way. I'll give you a more radical argument. The phenomenology is right. You were always right to say that organisms are well-designed, ecosystems are harmonious, but guess what? You thought that was the proof of the existence of an overarching, benevolent God who just made it all from his wisdom and goodness. Guess what? It's a correct observation about the outcomes, but it arises from something that couldn't be more mordantly different in its causal basis. In fact, it doesn't arise from any direct cause at all. The only thing that's actually happening out there in nature, in terms of causal theory, is that organisms are struggling for their personal benefits, expressed as reproductive success. That's all. There's no higher order harmony. There's no intrinsic good. There's just every organism out there struggling for itself. And good design and ecosystem harmony arises as a side consequence of that. Now, that's a really radical argument. The phenomenology is right, but it doesn't even have a direct cause. It's only a side consequence of something that, if you were to interpret it in human moral terms, which you should not, I repeat, would be precisely opposite to the Palean presupposition. All that's out there is organisms struggling for themselves and nothing else. Now, where does Darwin get an incredibly radical idea like that? Now, several years ago, because you can analyze Darwin's notebooks so carefully, and Frank did some of this work, Sylvan Schwaber and others, it's pretty clear that one of the main things Darwin was struggling with in the months before he had the Malthusian insight of September 1838 was the philosophical work of the Scottish economists centered on Adam Smith and their theory of how individual action shapes polities. And I would put it to you, again, it's a little oversimplified, that if you really wanted to characterize the most radical feature of Darwinian theory in a line or two, what you need to say, and it's also in part how Darwin actually got to it, though how he got to it is much more complex, you could say that Darwin basically transfers Adam Smith's economic argument into nature where it works. That's the beauty of it. I mean, what's the paradox of Adam Smith's argument? You want the maximal economy that will return the greatest good to the greatest number of people. How do you get it? Well, I would think, if somebody asked me that in my naivete, I would say, hey, that's easy. Get the people in the world who are smartest about this stuff, put them in a room and give them power. They know how to do it. Just let them do it directly. Let them legislate it. That's the equivalent. It's the closest human equivalent you can get to Paley's God, right? Let the people who are smartest about it just do it directly. And Adam Smith says, no, paradoxically, and nothing could be more paradoxical. You want to do what looks like exactly the opposite. You want to let each individual struggle to maximize his personal profit without any trammeling, laissez-faire. Just leave him alone. Let him do it. And paradoxical though that sounds, if you let individuals struggle freely for their own profits and nothing else, the ones who do it well beat the other ones, so you end up with good designs. And then they balance each other out, so you end up with harmonious ecosystems as side consequences of this paradoxical, almost cruelly sounding device of letting every individual struggle for himself and try to push anyone else to the wall who gets in the way. That's where, talking about great images in the English language, that's where Adam Smith introduces in a famous passage of The Wealth of Nations the great image of the invisible hand. You may think there's a law out there operating for good design and harmony of economic systems, but no, it is through the action of an invisible hand. There's no law regulating that. They're just organisms struggling for themselves, and that's what precipitates out. Now, here's the irony, as I always like to put it. You see, Adam Smith's economics doesn't work in economics. The most rigorously, viciously capitalistic economy in history has never allowed Adam Smith's economics to work, if only because they at least let churches give food to people who are starving. And they at least allow alms, even if they don't have government programs, because humans are moral agents. We don't allow Adam Smith's system to operate in human life, even in our cruelest economies. Of course we wouldn't, or at least have some moral restraint to a fellow person starving in the street sometimes. But of course nature is amoral, as Darwin realized. Nature is amoral. In nature, a very inefficient process like natural selection can actually shape evolutionary change because there's a lot of time out there. Darwin has this famous letter, which I can quote, I'm not quoting it exactly, it's a paraphrase that he wrote to Hooker, I think in 1855, many of you know it, where he says what a work a devil's chaplain could make of the miserable, low, blundering, and inefficient ways of nature. I don't have the adjectives exactly right, but that is the point. I mean, natural selection is a horrible system in human moral terms. You want to get from here to here, well, get there. Just figure out some way to move there directly. In Darwin's system, you get random variation in all directions around where you're starting. You kill off most of them differentially, and then you, by a process of selecting the few that happen fortuitously to vary in the right direction, reconstitute and inch your way along the way you want to go. It's a terrible system. If Lamarckism worked, Darwinian forces, which are so weak, would have no strength in this world. the reason why Darwinian forces are irrelevant to human evolution is that human cultural change is Lamarckian, and therefore it overwhelms Darwinian. Darwinism is a weak force. It only operates because you don't have inherent direction supplied by variation. It's a weak force that in human moral terms is horrendous, but nature's amoral. It's not a guide to amorality. Now, that's a really radical theory. The Adam Smith analogy through natural selection. We have an entirely naturalistic theory with no moral messages that has no inherent progress and is benchtop materialism in its application. That is, Darwin's not going to make any, he may himself have been a free thinker, he may himself have had atheistic leanings towards the end, we don't really know. He was not challenging anyone's personal God, but the notion of a God who sits on the clouds as a male human being and puts his finger in the operation of nature every generation, that's not going to go. You're going to at least have benchtop materialism in the actual workings of science. So those are the radical features of Darwinian theory. Now, last point on that, before I get to the other two, which will be shorter than that first one. Darwin has often been called a moral dolt because of this, someone who wrecked the previous notion of harmony and made nature this horrible place that instantiated Tennyson's famous line about red in tooth and claw. The true context of Tennyson's line is in one of those 300 essays. But and really it's just such an unfair charge. And I think we need to say that. I don't want to be unduly hagiographical towards Darwin. I don't think I generally am. But there is a greatness in Darwin's view. What he is telling us, I think, is that there cannot be, in the logic of the case, moral messages out there in nature in any case. That is not the source of moral truth and insight or lessons about the deeper meaning of life. There are aspects of meaning that science can comprehend. And therefore, if I must teach you this, if I must apply to your previous beliefs of nature's niceness the cold bath of my theory of natural selection, that's a cold bath worth taking. Because as long as you thought all things bright and beautiful, as one of Darwin's great metaphors in chapter 3 of The Origin is where he says, we behold the face of nature bright with gladness. And then he tells us, but look behind and see what's happening. I mean, he really has to tear this down. He says, take the cold bath, because as long as you thought it was all bright and beautiful, it's too easy to make the mistake that moral messages are there. Moral messages aren't there anyway. So if you constitute nature more properly as a system that was around for billions of years before we got here, didn't seem to know we were coming, doesn't particularly seem to give a damn about us, anyway, we have a better chance of finding the proper source of morality in philosophy, theology, or wherever one chooses to do so. I'll just read you a few lines from Darwin on that, because I really think he's been, this is from my book, Rocks of Ages, but there's this wonderful correspondence with Asa Gray, the great Harvard botanist, who, although very happy with Darwin's arguments about natural selection, was very dubious. As a believing Christian, wrote to Darwin and said, you got a good argument there, Charles, but I just find it so hard to accept what seem to me to be the implications that there's no deeper meaning in life and that there's no purpose to it all. And Darwin writes back basically saying, I'm not addressing that deeper question. I don't know how to. I don't think science can. He writes, I feel most deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. Famous comment. But then more directly in the correspondence with Gray, he writes back to Asa Gray after Gray has said, look, I'm willing to accept natural selection, but it just seems so contrary to how I think the Christian world has to go. And Darwin writes, with respect to the theological view of this question, this is always painful to me. I am bewildered. I had no intention to write atheistically, but I own that I cannot see as plainly as others do and as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides of us. Now, how's he going to deal with that then? And he has this brilliant line, which I've actually written about a lot. And he says, I am inclined, continue this letter, to look at everything as resulting from designed laws. So fine, that's okay. I mean, science can't deal with that in some broad sense anyway. With the details, whether good or bad, left to the working out of what we may call chance. So fine. Gray, I'll give you that. I don't know about the overarching principles. They're so far in the distance of what science can do anyway, but the details, whether good or bad, left to the workings of what we may call chance, by which he means contingency in history. Now, it's very interesting because you could go on from that, and if the realm of details is tiny, then it doesn't matter. But Darwin then goes on in the letter to try and convince Gray that the realm of details is effectively everything. It is anything that happens to an individual. It is the death of a species. It is the origin of the species. And since humans are species, it is the origin of humans also. It's just a brilliant letter. I'll just read you one last passage. He writes, this is actually a different letter, but also to Gray. One more word on designed laws and undesigned results. I see a bird, which I want for food. I take my gun and kill it. I do this designedly. An innocent and good man stands under a tree and is killed by a flash of lightning. Do you believe? And I really should like to hear that God designedly killed this man? See, that's a detail left to the workings out of what we may call chance. If you believe so, now he's going on, do you believe that when a swallow snaps up a gnat, that God designed that particular swallow should snap up that particular gnat at that particular instant? No. I believe that the man and the gnat are in the same predicament. If the death of neither man nor gnat are designed, I see no good reason to believe that their first birth or production should be necessarily designed. That is the origin of the species itself, which is all of evolution. So he's taking everything for that realm of detail. This is a hard issue, folks. I will simply read to you, as I often do, my favorite poem on this subject, which is Robert Frost's wonderful sonnet, and it's a true sonnet, called Design. Frost was, by the way, clearly very interested in Darwin. He didn't explain in detail much of what but many of his poems must be definite comments on particular Darwinian paradoxes, and I think this one actually is a comment on the correspondence with Gray, which he certainly knew and read. But it's the paradox of design, and I think it is the answer. It's Darwin's answer, and I think it's right. Frost tells the following story. He's walking along one morning, and he sees this incredible scene. There are three white things together, and they seem so beautifully designed that how could you not see this as intended? So he says, I found a dimpled spider, fat and white, on a white heel-all, a flower that's usually blue, that's the important point, holding up a moth like a white piece of rigid satin cloth, assorted characters of death and blight, mixed ready to begin the morning right, like the ingredients of a witch's broth, a snowdrop spider, a flower like a froth, and dead wings carried like a paper kite. Isn't that a wonderful image? Three white objects of different geometries. The two-dimensional wings, the ball of the spider, the froth of the flower, all white. How could that be accidental? He goes on. What had that flower to do with being white? Because heel-holes are usually blue. Sometimes they're white. What had that flower to do with being white? The wayside blue and innocent heel-all. What brought the kindred spider to that height? Then steered the white moth thither in the night. And then, as Frost so often does, the answer is given in just the last two lines, very quickly. What but design of darkness, darkness to appall, if design govern in a thing so small? And of course, that's the answer. Design doesn't govern in a thing so small. That's one of those details left to the workings out of what we call chance, but as Darwin told us, that realm of detail is effectively the realm of all phenomenology, and that is a radical argument. So that's point number one, the main point. Point number two, and Ernst Mayr has always argued, I think quite correctly, that if you really, yes, of course, the discovery of evolution is Darwin's radical contribution, and yes, the radical character of the theory, but in terms of the reform of Western philosophy, in a sense, the biggest message of Darwinian evolution, as opposed to other kinds of progressive inherencies as evolutionary theory, is that Darwin's evolutionary theory is about variation. One way that professionals often use to characterize Darwin's theory in a sentence is to say that Darwinian theory is about the conversion of variation within a population into the differences between species. That's actually quite profound, because it may be a commonplace to us at the beginning of the 21st century, but that's a hard concept for a 19th century thinker, that the variation within a population somehow get transformed into the differences between separate species. That's really hard. But if you think about it, the whole theme of variation in Western Platonic traditions, in Platonic traditions, variation is accident, which literally means falling away from the mean or the essence of the thing. Variation is traditionally treated as a set of odd accidents of individual imperfect incarnations of an inherent essence that can never be perfectly expressed in material reality. And therefore, the essence is central, and the variation is mere accident. Darwin completely inverts that. In Darwinian thought, the variation is the essence. What is the essence of a species but the spectrum of its variation, which is available for conversion into evolutionary change? The essence, the old essence, becomes the abstraction. The mean value is just something you might calculate as a convenience. That's a profound change in perception. And it's, again, of great practical importance. And now I show the next slide. This goes right back to David Baltimore's talk that began this. Let's see if this is going to work. Yeah, this is a very troubling slide, one of my favorites. This is a French satirical commentary published in 1811 on the display in London, but she was also displayed in Paris, of a South African woman who was known as the Hottentot Venus. Testimony to both racism and sexism. She was not just the Hottentot person, she was the Hottentot Venus, because it was her sexuality that misperceived. But I won't go into an exegesis of this whole slide. It's actually quite complex and very interesting. But it shows our unfortunate, see what Baltimore was saying is so right. One of the most profoundly interesting and ultimately liberating discoveries of the last 20 years is the recognition that there is effectively no meaningful average genetic differences among our racial groups, largely because Homo sapiens is such a variable species. You take any one, even restricted population, you're already picking up most of the genetic variation. Our races, though we spread out all over the world and we look superficially different as a result of some geographic differentiation, you're talking about 100,000 years for all non-African racial diversity, which is effectively nothing in evolutionary terms, and they're just the variation. Homo sapiens is the variation among 6 billion of us, and it's not partitioned out into discrete racial entities. That is a profoundly liberating notion that flows from the contingencies of how this particular story worked out in a Darwinian worldview, and is not available under the old essentialist notion that if you see variation, you have to rank it linearly, when then given our prejudices expressed in racism, sexism, and 100 other isms, lead to this sort of stuff. What I love about this is, you see, this is les curieux en extase, or les cordons de souliers, the curious in ecstasy, or the shoelaces. The woman is bending down. Now, there's a complicated story. What she's claiming to tie her shoelaces, she's really trying to get a look at the so-called Hottentot veil, the mysterious flap of skin that hangs down from the pudenda of Khoisan women. That's not the point I wanted to make here. The main point is I think the satirist is telling us that despite these differences in our clothing and demeanor, we're all pretty much the same. She's bending down really to look at Saki Bartman's Sinus Pudoris, but at the same time, you know the old stories about what Scotsmen do and don't wear under their kilt. She's looking at this gentleman whose sword is hanging in an interesting position. While at the same time, this dog, I believe, is trying to remind us that underneath whatever we're wearing, we're all pretty much the same, aren't we? Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, I can. So there is a truly radical second feature of a Darwinian worldview, which we yet have come to terms with. The third one, which has to do with historicity and contingency, and I am running out of time, so I'm not going to say as much I had intended about this. But you see, under most what I'm calling more user-friendly notions of evolution, you may still think, even though you have to acknowledge it's a naturalistic process and there is one Etz Chaim, there's one tree of life out there, still you can construe it as a predictable sequence. Maybe every little detail isn't predictable. There's a broad kind of progress. That is inherent in to this day, most people who exclaim a belief in evolution, who even consider themselves Darwinian, still see it that way. Survey data, I think, are very clear on that the vernacular understanding of evolution is it's a process that means increasing complexity. If you can't exactly be sure that Homo sapiens would have emerged, at least something like it is very likely, because that's what evolution means. But Darwinian evolution isn't that. One of the fascinating things that flows from it, because it is only about local adaptation, and local adaptation is to immediate environments that are changing essentially on random vectors through geological time, so that even if you have the determinism of local adaptation for any moment, since it's a determinism of local adaptation to fluctuating environments that are essentially stochastic through time, it's going to give you a stochastic pattern for the history of life, and therefore you're stuck in a true Darwinian worldview that Darwin himself kind of nuanced a bit around, because that was hard to accept all of. You're going to be stuck with a view of unpredictable history. History as following a stochastically varying vector of environmental circumstances through time. That's a scary notion, that actual history is unpredictably contingent. Now, what's interesting about it is we accept that. For human history, we even think that it's interesting. Well, not without a struggle. There have been plenty of deterministic theories of history from Spengler and Toynbee and others, and there's still issues on this. But by and large, I think we have become comfortable with contingent views of human history. We understand there isn't that kind of predictability. We understand that, in fact, it's one of the fascinations that allows us to believe that an apparently insignificant individual life, like Jimmy Stewart in that film, can actually make a difference, because little tiny things that seem totally meaningless at the time can cause history to cascade down a totally different pattern. That's why it is a wonderful life. You just read the two prefaces to Tolstoy's War and Peace. You get the high culture version. Look at the Back to the Future trilogy. You get the pop culture version. Look at Groundhog Day, by the way, and you get the one serious non-contingency film that was ever made. That's a film about Spinozistic determinism. Freedom's the recognition of necessity. It's the only serious film that's ever been made on the opposite position. For the most part, pop culture loves contingency because it empowers individuals and their apparently insignificant lives. This is one of the most famous spots in American history. This is the angle at Gettysburg. That's a very clump of trees 100 years later, towards which Robert E. Lee directed his men in Pickett's Charge. There's the cycloramic painting of Pickett's Charge, which I like to say because the original was built to hang in the Cyclorama building, which is 3 blocks from where I live in the south end of Boston. I like to show that one. It's by Philippe Poteau. It still sits at the battlefield of Gettysburg. We're comfortable with contingency here. Yeah, I mean, you could say some people had in the deterministic vein that the North was so much bigger and more economically powerful it had to win, but as you read modern historians, McPherson and others, they point out that the Civil War never was a war of conquest. Had it been a war of total conquest, of course, the South could not have conquered the North, but it wasn't. The South's war aims, as with any small group that defeats larger groups, and that happens all the time from Vietnam and elsewhere, the South's war aims were to keep going until they until they induce sufficient war weariness to get the North to recognize their boundaries. And McPherson makes a strong case, at least up until the re-election of Lincoln in 1864. That was eminently doable. It's July 4th, 1863, folks. I know Vicksburg fell to Grant on the same day. Not everything was terrible for the North, but this is southern Pennsylvania. This is not exactly the Deep South. Whatever you might say about the general strength, the forces were balanced at Gettysburg. Now, here's the point. We know why the North prevailed at Gettysburg, but it has nothing to do with predictability under nature's laws. It doesn't even have anything to do with something so crude as predictability under Voltaire's dictum that God's always with the bigger battalions. Sides were evenly matched at Gettysburg. We know why the North won. And I don't think there's a whole lot of historical debate about that, but every one of the 10 or 20 crucial events are odd contingencies of the moment. They are historical moments, any one of which could have gone in another direction. It's because the new second in command under Lee after the death of Stonewall Jackson was too cowardly to try and take the high ground as Stonewall Jackson would have done and could have. And if you know the battlefield side, the North's possession of the high ground was crucial. It's because Mr. Chamberlain of whatever Maine battalion it was made the last successful bayonet charge because he was out of ammunition in modern warfare and prevented the flanking of the Union line, which could easily have been flanked on the second day of the battle. It's because Lee made a terrible error, which he acknowledged immediately after seeing Pickett's charge go up to such disaster. The Northern battery had gone silent. He thought they were out of or low on ammunition. They weren't. They had gone silent with plenty of ammunition, hoping to draw Lee into exactly this blunder. I think we know why it happened, but they are moments of contingent history, any one of which could have gone the other way. Now you can say to yourself, but so it's a great story. It tugs at our heartstrings, but what's the difference? The North would have won anyway, and even if the South won, hey, slavery would have ended, the country would have reamalgamated. What's the difference except it tugs at our heartstrings, and we all had to memorize 7 years ago our forefathers set forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty. I'm the last generation that had to memorize that. But I'm not so sure that's right, folks. You know, when I was younger, I used to think that all of Lincoln's very bombastic words about the cost of preserving the Union, it's worth all these debts, could never justify Antietam. I'm not so sure in my midlife that that's so because, to put it not overly romantically, but I do believe this is my patriotic, my little patriotic side of me. But look, this is the greatest experiment in democracy that's ever been tried in human history. I mean, no nation has tried ever to make, with all its faults, a democratic system across such an enormous expanse of geography, of climate, of cultural traditions, of professions. If we had let it crumble and break into two here, why do you assume it would have reamalgamated? Yes, slavery would have formally ended. Why would it not just have split up more and balkanized as much as Europe? with very different consequences for U.S. history and for the history of the world. I don't think that's being overly dramatic. A lot may have been at stake in human history here at the Field of Gettysburg, and I don't want to exaggerate. We're comfortable with that for human history. We're not comfortable with that for the Darwinian history of life, which is contingent in exactly the same way. Why are we here? Even to enjoy the proceedings, I hope you did today. Boy, I'm running. You don't mind if I go another 15 minutes? Huh? Yeah, okay. Why are we even here? Is it part of the predictable unfolding of natural law? No, it isn't. It's the contingency of history. It's thoroughly permissible under the Darwinian models of natural selection. There's 100,000 events, any one of which could have let history cascade down different channels. The asteroid 65 million years ago that triggers the extinction of dinosaurs. Run the tape again, and that's only one of 10,000 cases, and it doesn't hit this time. It doesn't hit at such a crucial moment. And, mammals had lived for the entire reign of the dinosaurs. Dinosaurs and mammals arose at the same time, virtually, in the late Triassic. 130 million years of dinosaurian domination of the environments. I don't know why I'm pointing, because that's another slide, but I'm getting to the environments of large-bodied terrestrial creatures. The dinosaurs' world, mammals are little creatures in the interstices thereof. There's only been 65 million since, absent some ultimately random bolt from the blue that happened to do in the dinosaurs and allow mammals to survive and then flourish in an emptied-out world. I see no reason to think that the dinosaurs wouldn't still be lording it over mammals. And despite some of our progressivistic hopes, I don't think dinosaurs were on any path that was leading to an alternate form of self-consciousness. I think absent that great contingent event, dinosaurs would still be lording it over mammals, and there wouldn't be any conscious creatures to record the glories of this alternate view of life, and that would be that. Be just as interesting a world, but no record keeper. Now, you can say, but when the going gets tough, the tough get going. They didn't do it for 120 million years, but then when there was a really tough time, mammals show their superiority over dinosaurs. That doesn't wash very well, given the length of time, but think about it another way. We don't know why mammals made it and dinosaurs died, but small creatures do generally tend to do better than large ones in catastrophic events, in part because their population sizes tend to be larger. It's the more ants than elephants principle, if you will. You can't argue under any notion of causality that we would recognize that mammals held a conclave 75 million years ago and said, hey, this asteroid's coming in 10 million years, let's stay small because we'll have a better chance to get through. If that's an important part of the explanation, the contingent explanation, it's a real explanation. See, contingency is not about inexplicability. That's the mistake people make. Because unfortunately, one of the vernacular meanings of random is exactly that. That's not the technical meaning of random, as you well know. I don't have to give that little mini lecture here. Contingency is about an alternate mode of explanation based on the actual occurrence of unpredictable but ascertainable events. It gives you as much power, explanatory power, as any other scientific model. It happens to be appropriate to certain kinds of sequences. So suppose mammals do get through because they're small, and that gives them a fortuitous advantage at this great moment. Why were they small? I mean, they were small not because they were biding their time. They were small because they never had success competing against dinosaurs. It's negative reasons, if that story goes, that allow us to be here at all, and that's how history is made. The reason I just love this example, because if you think that everything that happened, and I think Jared Diamond's book on gun germs is a brilliant book, but he goes too far, because after making a brilliant and I think undoubtedly correct analysis of, since people are all much of a muchness, if there are regularities like mid-latitude people inventing agriculture and being able to move on to technologies, it's got to be the nature of the places and not of the people, because people are much the same. But then he makes the mistake of wanting to get all the details as well, why it's us and not China. You'd have been a fool in 1420 not to bet on China. I mean, when Zheng He was sailing ships 8 times longer than Columbus's biggest caravel 70 years before to the southern tip of Africa, would you have voted on Europe? Now, Jared says, oh, but China had to fail because it was so centralized a system that as soon as the Yongle Emperor died, that they were able to call that back, and Europe prevailed because of its balkanization. But suppose China had prevailed, wouldn't you then be arguing, although you've written it in Mandarin, that of course China had to win because its centralized system made it able to carry this stuff on, and balkanized Europe never could have done it. No, the reason why I show you this slide is that every once in a while, the problem with contingent history is that you can't have a science of unique events. You don't have repeatability. That's the classic problem of historical analysis. But every once in a while, you get, albeit imperfectly, you get a natural experiment. Here's a beautiful natural experiment. It's imperfect, as all natural experiments must be, but there was a crux in the Eocene period when, under certain interpretations, I have to talk with Don about this, what the latest is on this issue, but at least there was a time when they were not overpowering mammalian carnivores, and there were groups of carnivorous ground birds. And for a while, it wasn't clear that the carnivorous faunas of the tertiary world were going to be ruled by mammalian carnivores and not by the carnivorous ground birds. Now, we know that the ground birds lost on the northern continents, and so we say, well, it had to be. Everybody knows 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, right? Learn that. In other words, we think it had to be because it happened. But you see, nature did an experiment for us in this time. There's a second experiment. South America, you may not know this, was an isolated island continent until the Isthmus of Panama arose, which evolved a unique and independent fauna more outstandingly different than that of Australia. It's just that we lost most of them because after the rise of the Isthmus, there was this interchange. Now, on South America, there was an imperfect replay of this experiment, and although there were some carnivores, they were marsupial carnivores, by the way, the birds won, or at least held a major stake. The major carnivores, native carnivores of South America, this forest-raked ground birds, shown here in a famous Charles R. Knight illustration of a forest-raked lording it over a mammal it's just killed. Here, you know, round 2 to the birds. It's not clear. Now, the reason I bring this up, replay the tape on the northern continents, let the birds win there too. Are you so confident that 50 million years later, a small lineage in Africa would have lived on the savannas and become upright among the primates and turned into? I don't know. The whole fauna would have been different if it had been birds and not felines. I don't know if you ever got to that point. I don't know how you could say that. The 100,000 incidents of contingent history, and that flows from the Darwinian view. It's very hard. Now, if I had had time, which I do not, I was going to spend, Michael urged me. You may not believe this because I'm a talkative, arrogant soul, and I certainly admit that. But in fact, it is hard for me to talk about myself personally. I do so very rarely. I mean, the only thing I ever wrote about a 2-year battle with cancer was an article about statistics, and that's all I ever wanted to do. And Michael did ask me to say some things about what I do and how I do it, and we can turn that off. Now, because I've talked so long on the other stuff, I can think about half of that, but I do need to say something. I was going to, and I will not, talk about what I've tried to do. In other words, the reason why I set it up is here we are faced with the Great Revolution. Turn off Forrest Rakers. I love it, but you don't need to stare at it. Yeah. Faced with this greatest revolution, the one about essences and not real estate, I mean, how do we deal with it, especially in both technical and popular terms? I was going to say something about what I've tried to do in the technical world of professional evolutionary theory. I wanted to make the argument that despite this radical part of Darwinism, there are ways in which more traditional views have hung on, particularly adaptationism, the more specific claim that even if it's a contingent, odd world out there, at least things work. At least things are out there. They have purposes that are locally adaptive. At least we can take some comfort in that. And then I was going to talk about the extrapolationist premise and saying that, well, all right, it's tough to understand this, but at least it's the small little things, the Grand Canyon eroded, as we heard about, it's evident dropped by grain. That makes history. We can see history. It's nice and smooth and steady and extrapolative. To me, the most interesting things that are happening technically in evolutionary theory, a whole variety of ideas that are breaking down. I think those last pillars of comfort. I did talk about mass extinction theory and what it means for the affirmation of contingent history. That's my dinosaur example. I want to talk about punctuated equilibrium as a break upon, that is breaking, not a car brake, but a fracturing of the extrapolationist premise, because you now have to explain trends, which is still the primary phenomenon of macroevolution, as the differential survival of certain kinds of species and not as the anagenetic transformation of lineages. I want to talk about the critique of adaptation and the reconstruction of evolutionary theory. It's very important to Darwin that natural selection, because remember, he's trying to overthrow the Palean perspective. It's very important to Darwin that natural selection work on organisms and not on higher entities, and not on a hierarchy of entities simultaneously, but on organisms with the rarest of exceptions. That's one of the brilliances of his theory, but we're having this very interesting modern reconstruction in which you retain a Darwinian core, but you have gene level and organism level and deme level and species level selection all operating simultaneously. It's a much more interesting theory, and I've been trying to work some of that out, and I do have a long technical book, which will be called The Structure of Evolutionary Theory, that will be published by Harvard Press. I told them that, I just handed it in, I told them it's my conceit, but it has to be a millennial book. 2002 may be palindromic, but it's uninteresting. You can put it out December 31st, 2001, but you can even put it out in February 2002 as long as you backdate it and put 2001 on it. So you should see it in 2001. And then I was going to, and I will, just for a few minutes, talk about my so-called popular work. But I do deeply believe, by the way, there is no difference. I have never seen my so-called popular writing as any different, maybe different in the language one chooses to use, any different in content or intent from my technical publications. And I will confess to you, I feel great frustration because I think I've actually made some discoveries, some of which are reasonably interesting, that I chose to put in the essays rather than in technical publications, and just simply aren't cited by professional colleagues because they don't read it or because they don't think that citation of natural history is acceptable in professional publications, and that is frustrating to me. I don't think there is a difference. I want to talk about integration, and the first theme is the integration of technical and so-called popular writing. Just a couple things really quickly. I don't like the phrase science writer. I hate it applied to myself, but I don't like it in general. I'm not a science writer. Yeah, I'm writing about science. I'm a scientist who's trying to explain what I'm doing, or what this view of life to which I've committed myself means, or what I think it means for us and for me. I was having a conversation with my editor the other day because we were talking about a book I don't want to do, and she'd like me to substitute something else. So she said, well, what interests you in evolutionary theory? Why don't you just go out and find something that interests you in evolutionary theory? Write a book. I said, Pat, you just don't understand. I'm not a journalist. I don't write about things that interest me. There are 100 things that interest me. If I'm going to write a book, it's got to be about something that's from my heart. That's my conceit. It has to be something I work on, something I think I have some expertise or I have some perspective on. I'm not a reporter. No, and the other thing is, which sounds arrogant as hell, but I think you'll understand it in the spirit in which it's intended, which is partly of arrogance, namely that although it has been enormously important, and I say this in total sincerity, that people have read the essays, have written me wonderful letters, have solved every problem. I mean, I started early in the essays when I didn't know the answer to something that was peripheral. I didn't know the answer to something central. I didn't write the essay. To just simply ask my readers, well, how did the term segue get from classical term in music to mean in pop culture a transition? I have never asked a question of readers that wasn't answered definitively. In that particular, I got some wonderful letters from old-time radio men of the 1920s who said they had been trained in classical music. They started using the term as disc jockeys, and in writing radio plays, they read it into there. And I've never had a question, no matter how technical, that went unanswered. And I love this dialogue I have with readers. But you know what? I wrote those essays for myself, if the truth be told. I wrote them because I had to and because I needed to learn things, which is why I didn't write about punctuated equilibrium. I hope I know that stuff. I don't write essays about it. And the only defense for that is that I think if you didn't do it because you had to, or because you did it for yourself, they wouldn't be good after a while. After a while, when you realize people liked them and they paid you pretty well for them, if you didn't do it because you had to, where would the source come from? I don't know. Maybe it does for some people. Wouldn't for me. Anyway, on the last issue of, two last issues of cross-disciplinarity, history and science and other things I try and bring in, I don't try and bring in lots of other peripheral subjects because I think it's good and humanistic and all that, although I certainly do, but because these things really go together. I mean, the division between art and science and all sorts of evolutionary disciplinary divisions that we have for contingent reasons of academic and other history really do us more harm than good. My wife, Rhonda, who's here, runs a lab in our house called the Art Science Research Laboratory, dedicated to breaking down that barrier and is discovering wonderful science implicit in the works of Duchamp and other artists. And it is interesting and important stuff. Let me just give you two examples of the issue of art and science. This is my last set of slides, so let's turn that on one last time. The meaningless, I mean, look, I don't say there's a distinction of subject matter. Art has to answer aesthetic issues that science can't directly deal with. Science deals with factual questions. It's not the subject matter of art. But I think the mental processes that go into creativity in both realms in their similarity outweigh the intrinsic differences in subject matter. Just two, these are both classical examples. Here I do need lights off because this is pretty. I'm going to give you just two examples to stand for many things. They are classic examples of how art and science might be related. They're opposite. One is the case of where, what's the difference? How can you call, it's the taxonomic boundary issue. Is this art or science and does it matter? And the second is where the existing boundaries have kept things apart and have delayed the solution to certain particular questions. And I'll tell you what, this is Ernst Haeckel, who was spoken of and sung of by Richard. Now, he wrote a great book. This isn't one of them. This is from some of his technical publications. That's another one. Haeckel himself was quite a good artist. He wrote a book in 1904 called Kunstformen der Natur, Art Forms in Nature. And what is it? Is it an art treatise in the reigning Jugendstil, what Art Nouveau is called in Germany? Or is it a treatise in natural history? Well, folks, it doesn't matter. I mean, he arranged organisms on the pages of the, first of all, it's called Kunstformen der Natur, art forms in nature, but what does it matter? Deeply, they are both. In some cases, he distorted the organisms. That we know. They're clearly arranged in this. You won't see a jagged line of the later, a jagged angle of the later Art Deco style. You see nothing but the swirls and whirls of the Art Nouveau, of Jugendstil. So what is it? Is it art or is it science? And what's the difference, folks? It's obviously both and neither. I'll just quickly run through these. Here's a slide of the, now, you know, do Medusae in nature have tentacles that ever take this form? Or are these the swirls of the Jugendstil? And does it matter? Likewise for cephalopods, likewise for spiders and mites. Look at those jellyfish. Oh, these are siphonophores. No, they're Medusae. Why pick these particular blastoids in a group of extinct echinoderms? Again, more Medusae. Yeah, these are all clams. They're real clams. These ones are actually even fairly accurately drawn, but why choose them? Why mount them on their edges? Why show them with these forms? Or these brachiopods with internal skeletons that do exist, but are certainly in the favored forms of Hector Guimard and others. Why these arthropods? And then I did that one before, sorry. And then you get these mass scenes of lizards, of frogs, of turtles, of hummingbirds, and of orchids, finally. It deeply doesn't matter, folks. Now, one other story. This is one of those little discoveries I made. I confess some pride in. I think it's been pretty much not seen because it's in a popular essay. But I pose you a problem. What is the only work of Edgar Allan Poe that was reprinted in his lifetime? And it's not The Raven, which was nevermore, just like... No, the work of Poe, the only one reprinted in his lifetime, is the following. It's the conchologist's first book. He really wrote it. There it is. See, there's his name. Now, this book, I didn't discover this book. The point is, this book is an embarrassment to Poe scholars. They know this. They know the story of its reprinting. But they're embarrassed because it's a largely plagiarized book, and I'm not saying it isn't. The plates at the end of it were simply lifted from a European publication. There were no effective copyright laws at the time, but Poe did write the text. And that itself is a mystery, because first of all, it's a mystery because he has no recorded interest in natural history, none whatsoever, despite the ape and the murders in the Rue. Oh, I gave it away, but I assume most of you read the story and the murders of the Rue Morgue and others. There's no evidence. I mean, you look for scraps. People say, well, before he was cashiered as a soldier, he served on an island in South Carolina where a naturalist named Ravenel lived, and maybe he met Ravenel, but there's no evidence that he did. That's as close as you can get. Why? That's the first thing. Why did Poe write this? And The other reason historians are embarrassed is that it looks like hackwork. The plates are plagiarized and the text seems so uninspired. Poe always claimed that he had done something original without ever making it clear, and you know what? He did. But here's a wonderful case where the answer is really simple, folks. And the only reason I happen to be the first to recognize it is that no one had come to this problem with a technical knowledge of the history of malacology and malacological classification, because the answer is so simple once you know that. Any professional malacologist would have known it, but professional malacologists didn't know this because it's art, and artists who were interested in the mysteries of this work of Poe didn't know the issue in malacology. It's simple. This is what it is. When Linnaeus classified mollusks, he said that it would be better to have a classification based on soft parts. But he was going to base his classification only on shells because collectors only kept the shells and they threw away the soft parts. So he was going to allow himself this unnatural classification. Lamarck did the same thing. He greatly increased the number of Linnaeus's genera of mollusks, but he also did his classification only on soft parts, only on hard parts. There had never been a classification of mollusks that tried to combine the artificial information on hard parts with the more important anatomical information on soft parts. France, as I said before, you can turn this off now, was the leading nation in natural history at the time. The only works that had ever been done that tried to include soft part description with shells, there was no formal classification, were done by French zoologists. There was no work in English at that time. Now, Poe knew nothing about natural history, but he was commissioned to do this by a man named Wyatt, who wanted a cheap version of a book he had written which used only the shell classifications that he could sell at his Chautauqua-type lectures. And it's simple. Poe didn't know beans about natural history, but he sure was fluent in French. And he was the only member, he's the only friend in Wyatt's circle who was fluent in French. And that's why he got the job. He was paid to do this, but he did something that was interesting and original. It's the first malacological work in English that attempts to put the soft part and hard part descriptions together, even if they're just translated from French sources. And that was just totally missed. No one had ever seen it, and it's so simple, but you have to know the relevant information from both fields. Let me have the lights. Finally, but in terms of interdisciplinarity, I made a personal decision, and that was you just can't do that many things. I didn't want to, as a crazy, obsessive kind of writer, give up everything else in my life. I decided consciously at some point that I would at least keep, in a non-amateurish and serious way, two very different other things in my life. Oh, I do have two more slides. So leave it up. It's okay. First is choral music. In which I have written some about, but the reasons for that is it fulfills something emotional more than anything else. It's also the one thing that you can do at a quite competent professional level with the minimal in music, with the minimal amount of time that people like myself might have to put into it, and it's given me some wonderful experiences I never could have had in science. I'll never forget, for example, singing Berlioz's Requiem and understanding the emotional power of sheer sound. It had nothing to do with musical beauty. But I knew the piece. I'd known it for years. But the first time at the dress rehearsal that I heard the four brass choirs come in together and the 10 timpani bang in unison before the basses alone, my section has to sing out the great tuba mirum spargens sonum, the final trumpet shall sound. I couldn't sing. I was in tears. The sound of the four brass choirs, it was like being a fish with a lateral line system to perceive sound through motion. I mean, you could feel the banging of the timpani rising up through the wooden risers. I mean, you understand something then. But just some experiences I've had to sing Haydn's Creation on January 1st, 2000. You can't, what do they say that MasterCard ad? Some things are priceless. 2 weeks from now, I'm going to sing Elijah, Mendelssohn's Elijah in Symphony Hall on the 100th anniversary to the day, because this is the 100th anniversary of the opening of Symphony Hall, when the Boston Symphony Orchestra and the Handel and Haydn Society sang Mendelssohn's Elijah. There are only two choruses in Boston still existent that were there 100 years ago. Mine, the Boston Society, which opened Symphony Hall on October 15, 1900 with the American premiere of Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, and the Handel and Haydn Society. We're putting the two choruses together that still exist to do Elijah on the 100th anniversary. That doesn't necessarily mean, those things are meaningful to me. That's the only way I could have it. And the other one is baseball. I don't know what the score is right now, but I'll show you two last slides. But if they don't win today, they'll win tomorrow. Oh, I'm sorry, this is mine. What I love about baseball, it's excellence that I love. And the wonderful thing about excellence in baseball is it can be personified in the very rare individuals who have it at the core of their being, the greatest American of the 20th century with me and my kid, or in the pitching of a Pedro Martinez or the home run hitting of Mark McGwire, both of which I got to see at the All-Star game and the home run derby before in Boston last year. But there's also the great democratic point that even a journeyman can have one great day in the sun. Any fan knows that moment, right? That's the last pitch of Don Larson's perfect game in the 1956 World Series. And those are species of excellence. One hopes one strives for in one's life. One is the Jimmy Stewart hope of contingency, that even a journeyman can have a grand moment. Okay, that's it for the slides. And now the lights. Final point. The greatness of evolution, I guess is why I am proud of 300 essays, never a month missed, 304 months for the two-part essays. But there's this famous statement, which I have to confess is one of the ugly sexist comments of our literature. But Dr. Johnson famously remarked that on women preachers, that they were like a dog standing on its hind leg. You see the amazing thing, you know this line, you may not know he said it with respect to women preachers, which he did, that the amazing thing is not that it's done well, but that it's done at all. And I guess that's the way I feel about evolution. The grand theme of evolution is continuity. It's continuity. You realize, if you want to talk about miracles, this is how I started my last essay, which will appear in a couple months. When I was a kid, I used to think about eternity and infinity, and I couldn't comprehend them. How could there be a beginning? If God made a beginning, who began God? You can't get out of eternity, whether you invest it in material things or a divine creator. What about infinities? If you go out, how can the universe end? If there's a brick wall, what's beyond the brick wall? The bricks can't go on forever. I mean, that was a childish way of thinking about it, but I don't think I've gotten one iota further to this day. Now, as I like to say, I accept the Dorothean dictum. There's no place like home. I'm going to look for miracles here. The great miracle, metaphorically speaking, is the continuity of life. 3.5 billion years since the first bacterium of the fossil record, not one day off. The Earth never freezes through all its ice ages, not for a minute. DNA never has an hour off to celebrate its existence. Life goes through mass extinction cycles, never descends below the zero line. What physical process goes along for 3.5 billion years and never once touches the zero line that's running along under it the whole time? You're throwing those dice billions of times. The probability is maybe incalculably low, but think of how many times you've thrown the dice. You've got to cross the zero line. Most natural processes do it. You know, one year a healthy Mark McGwire would hit 0 home runs, but so what? It would just be a temporary embarrassment. The next year he'd be back. But life is different. If it ever even touches the zero line, it's gone forever. And it never did. And if there isn't something just wonderfully miraculous about sheer continuity. Now, I do believe in the principle of microcosms. I do have a story about my grandfather and his landing in America 100 years ago, but instead I'm going to tell you 2 microcosms and end finally. This is the other story I tell in this last essay. This is a book. I have no idea why I'm fortunate enough to own this. I think when it was described in the auction catalog, people just didn't read the description, or it would have been way outside any conceivable price range of any academic. But this is one of 5 volumes. The book itself is of no great importance. It's the most famous of all Italian Renaissance poems, Gerusalemme Liberata of Torquato Tasso, very politically incorrect poem about Godfrey de Bouillon and the capture of Jerusalem from the Saracens in 1099 and all that. But that's not the point. There's the most wonderful of inscriptions on this page, which anyone may take a look at afterwards. Let me tell you the story. T.H. Huxley went to Australia on the rattlesnake, following in Darwin's footsteps, if you will, 15 years later. He's had wonderful experiences on his circumnavigation, but he had one benefit that Darwin didn't have, though Darwin got it in other ways. Huxley met his future wife in Australia. Huxley also wanted to learn Italian. In fact, he read Dante's Inferno in the original Terza Rima on one of his jaunts during this voyage. He meets Nettie Heathorn, as he calls her. He meets his Nettie in Sydney in 1849. As he's about to leave, Nettie Heathorn, her half-sister Oriana, and her brother-in-law, Oriana's husband, William Fanning, present these 5 volumes of Torquato Tasso to Huxley, about to go back to England. She follows him 5 years later. They marry, have a wonderful family and life by standards of the time. And she writes on this, T.H. Huxley, a birthday and parting gift in remembrance of 3 dear friends, May 4th, 1849. That's what she writes. It's right there. Now, that's not the story. 60 years later, Huxley dies, 1895. They lose only one of their children, Huxley's favorite son, Noel, good by Victorian standards. But she is blessed with two brilliant grandchildren, and others, as you know, Aldous Huxley, the writer, and Julian Huxley. She gives these books to Julian Huxley. It's now 1911, 28th of July, 1911. And she writes as Grandmoo, which is what Huxley called her. The same woman, 63 years later, after as a young fiancé, she gives the books to dashing Hal. Hal has died 15 years before. She writes below the original inscription, her name, Nettie Heathorn, the name of our half-sister and brother-in-law, and she writes Sydney, New South Wales, so that Julian will know where it comes from. And then above she writes, and the contrast in the handwriting is wonderful, because this is an old woman in her 80s, 63 years after she has given the book to her dashing fiancé. She writes, Julian Sorrel Huxley, from his grandmother, Henrietta Ann Huxley, née Heathorn, Grandmoo, and then she writes the same word she wrote to T.H. 63 years ago, in remembrance, 28th July, 1911. Hoddesly Eastbourne. Now, if that doesn't say it without another word from me, I don't know what does. That's one. Second and last, on a broader sense, this is the oldest book I have, sort of the beauty of continuity, if you will. There's a wonderful story about it. This is the De Mineralibus of Albertus Magnus. It's one of the few 15th century books I own. It's incunabule, as people call them in the book business. That is, books published before 1500. But it's Albertus Magnus was the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. Obviously, this isn't from his time, but it is a pre-1500 printing. It was written in the 13th century, of course. What's interesting about De Mineralibus is you have to get yourself back into a scholastic mode of thought. Is a problem. Aristotle's, and St. Thomas, the greatest student of Albertus, writes the analysis of Aristotle's books on nature, and he says there are 8 books in the logic of the development. It has this wonderful, I was going to go into it, don't have time, but it has this wonderful dichotomous tree of the 8 books, but there's a real problem, which is really niggling to scholastic philosophy, wouldn't bother us one whit. Something's missing. There is no book on mineralogy transmitted from Greek thought, because Aristotle never published it, or it didn't come down to us. Theophrastus has a few fragments on mineralogy, Aristotle's great student, but there is no book on mineralogy. Now here's a problem. You've got everything else from Aristotle. So what does that do to the logic of the books of nature? There is no book on mineralogy. So is the next book, De Anima, is it book 6, which is its logical position, or is it book 5, because there's no mineralogy? That's a real problem, because, I don't have time. I have St. Thomas's commentary on that, but what he says is fascinating. He says the whole system of how we look at the world depends upon this, because if we classify by accidents, that is by the actual occurrences, then we don't have the mineralogy. So De Anima is book 5, because we have it, it's an entity. But if we classify by intrinsic logic, De Anima is book 6. And then there's a whole. Here's the solution. There is no classical work on mineralogy, but Albertus, his great teacher, although in Latin, puts together enough so that this will pass. This will serve as continuity, because at least it's pre-Thomas. It's just, again, a wonderful example of how we value continuity and how we struggle with it. And the last point I was going to make is this particular copy that I have is bound in a leaf of a medieval music manuscript. And the text is wonderful. I presume it refers to Solomon, but again, it's a statement about continuity. It stirs our soul. That's why evolution is so deep within us, and our family microcosms, like Huxley's, are this larger family microcosm of the history of intellectual life. It says, David ei Dominus Deus sedem David patris eus. The Lord God, Dominus Deus David ei, gave to him the seed of David and of his fathers. So it must refer to Solomon, and it goes on. Et regnabit in domo Jacob in aeternum, and he shall reign in the house of Jacob forever. And there it is, continuity surrounding Albertus's mineralogy, which is the solution to the problem of continuity in Thomistic logic. I thought that's great. And I'll end right there. Thank you very much.
There are microphones on the stands in the aisles for Q&A. Come on up. And
Won't be offended by anybody who leaves. That was a longer talk than I planned on
no, it was
giving,
just
but
fine.
it's,
That was just fine. So go ahead.
We'll
We
take
can go ahead
a
and
limited number of questions.
we'll take a handful. And we'll try to get the Yankee score.
Well,
Go ahead, sir.
there's another
Professor
game tomorrow.
Gould,
Worst comes to worst.
a couple of thoughts and questions from a non-scientist, poorly educated non-scientist. First, humanity is apparently the first animal species for which the earth is round. And freeze frame, and humanity is one species. Artists, poets, preachers insist humanity is one, a unity,
Hey, they're right.
a brotherhood, a family. I once heard Dobzhansky urge that we keep the total human gene pool together, all of which must suggest the ultimate conservatism. It seems relevant also.
Got a question?
I wonder, common chimps in different parts of a jungle begin to develop different cultures, as do North and South Pacific humpbacks and others. Until recently, at least even if one married a Japanese, he or she could
I need
not-
a question. I'm sorry. I gave too long a speech, but unfortunately, that's the undemocratic rules
Well,
of this game. I get to give the
Yeah,
speeches.
all right, I'll skip. Finally, I ask, should we not be skeptical of scientists and others who, whatever the impracticalities, fail to emphasize the total scenario, that is, with the unity, there's a role of peripheral isolation towards natural or perhaps now contrived attempts at speciation, who fail, unlike LA
I'm being much
State-
more polite than I usually am, but I really have to.
Okay, I was afraid of
But
that.
he's got only 3 more lines. Okay, I'm going to let.
Is the possibility, contrary to our myopia, that we or some among us may be an intermediate species? I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, you see, I mean, no, you raised, that's a very, very intriguing and interesting point. I confess, and I'm going to give you an answer that really doesn't reflect the depth of that question, because they're very important philosophical issues that you raised. But just speaking scientifically, I mean, to me, as a Darwinian biologist, a species has a certain definition. A species is an interacting group of organisms that are reproducible each with each other, though they may not be doing so for distance or whatever reason, and are, more importantly, are a discrete entity on the tree of life that is not broken up into subgroups. Now, the human species is clearly that. It's more clearly that than we ever knew it was, and I think that's the main significance of all these. Look, I mean, as I like to say, even a person of very good will would have been excused 20 years ago for thinking that racial genetic differences might be substantial, or they have no meaning in terms of how we treat people, because people look different. That turns out not to be true. Now, the point you raise is there are, of course, incipient differentiations, but the interesting thing is they're less now than they ever were. I mean, in the past, we were much more potentially differentiatable because we lived in very distant places, and isolated populations could, but never did, in part because they didn't have time, develop as separate species. Now I can't even imagine a scenario, since we move all over the world. We have this terrible habit of interbreeding wherever we go, and I don't think we're ever going to stop that. How are you ever going to isolate a human population to become a new biological species that we differentiate culturally is another issue. I think you have to go to science fiction scenarios like space colonies of humans that are separate for 10 or 20 generations. Then you could talk about it. But if anything, I think that we are more united than ever, and we have also learned that we're also biologically more similar to each other than we ever thought. So I think it's less likely. Yeah.
Your comments on the idea that part of the difficulty with the theory of evolution is in fact the term theory, that scientists mean one thing and the lay population means something entirely different when they use the term?
See, that's a deep issue in science in general, because you really have a problem if you're trying to communicate to the general public. Do you gain precision and always invent a new term, a scientific term? Or do you try to use a vernacular term if it's close enough? And you can't always invent a new term. You just can't, or else you'd be swamped and people wouldn't get it. So we do use vernacular language. But whenever you use vernacular language, these problems arise that vernacular meanings are never going to be precisely right, or they're going to be broader. Sometimes you get into terrible problems, like significance in statistics, which has a totally different meaning from ordinary vernacular significance. Random is another one. But I'm afraid that one of those words is theory. I mean, we're either going to have to, a theory to a scientist is a set of ideas that coordinates and explains a group of facts, and maybe right or maybe wrong. Science is never healthier than when it's having wonderful debates about theories, when it's pretty secure about the facts to which they relate. As I once stated somewhat facetiously, but I meant it seriously, there was a great debate about Newtonian versus Einsteinian issues of gravitation early in the 20th century, but apples didn't hang in midair pending the outcome. In fact, in theory are different things, but I think we're stuck. We're going to call it with the vernacular word theory, and then you have the problem that in vernacular English, one meaning of theory is pretty close to what scientists mean in a more technical sense, but theory also in vernacular English means less well ascertained than a fact, unfortunately. And creationists use that, and they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing perfectly well. They say, well, evolution is only a theory, and what kind of bill of goods are you trying to sell us? It's a theory, and you don't even know what the right theory is. You see, they're using the vernacular meaning that there's this hierarchy that goes from fact to theory to hypothesis to guess. So if it's only a theory, it's worse than a fact, and we can't even figure out what the right theory is. How can you deny creationists their day, and not in court, but in the classroom? That's just a conscious and cynical distortion. I mean, what we mean in science by theory, of course, is not something less than a fact, but a structure of explanation. But I don't know what general solution there is to that except good education, because you can't not use the vernacular language, and you're going to run into those problems. Yeah.
Earlier today, Dr. Friedman mentioned this book, Rare Earth, Why Intelligent Life in the Universe May Be Rare. I wonder if you've read that book, and if so, have you got any comments on it?
It's as I think Luke sort of quoted my, again, somewhat facetious but deeply meant line that the issue of intelligent life on other worlds is the most interesting unanswerable. It's not in principle unanswerable. We might get the answer from CD tomorrow, but it's the most interesting question that we can ask on which we have no idea how to get data right now. So in some sense, it's not even a scientific question, though we have to ask it because it's so fascinating. It really isn't. And let me tell you why. I have a different take on that. The Drake equation and other such ways of thinking about it, they're not real equations. They're ways of organizing thought. The problem is, and this is the best way I can put it, and this is why it's not a scientific question really, that the existence of intelligent life on Earth is absolutely and fully consistent. This is close to your aphorism of DiMaggio and others. It is absolutely consistent with either extreme alternative, that the existence of life on Earth means either that intelligent life almost has to be, because after all, if it evolved on the one world we know, how could its probability not be overwhelmingly high? It's consistent with that position, but it's also equally, totally consistent with the absolute opposite position, only here and nowhere else. This is a point William James made, and it's basic to probability theory, and he was absolutely right. If you make the prediction before something happens, then the existence of something surpassingly rare is very good evidence that you were wrong about its probabilities and it was somehow meant to be, or at least you might want to think. But you can't make the statement about rarity after it happens, because something has to happen. Because once you had life on Earth, it was going to be some outcome. Probably any outcome was equally rare. You can't look back after you have the outcome of intelligence and say, because that particular outcome is so rare, it had to be because a rare event happened. That just isn't fair. And so, you see, the point is, if intelligent life only arose here and nowhere else, we would still be here talking about it and wondering, because we'd be the only world that would be capable of talking about it, so we'd be talking about it here. And so therefore you have no information at all from the only source of evidence we have, which is the existence of intelligent life on our planet. Beyond that, you're into a realm of conjecture. At least I know how to pose the question. That's the one thing I'd say. Evolutionary theory helps us to pose the question. The trouble is we can't answer it. That is, what you want to ask is whether intelligence is convergible. Is intelligence like the wing of a bat, a bird, and a pterosaur, that it's just bound to happen because there are just so many things that can happen, and once you reach a certain level, because I'll grant you bacterial life as a predictability, we just can't answer that question because we only have the one experiment. I mean, until we can know, I'm pretty confident that there isn't going to be any other planet that has creatures with 5 of these and 2 of these that works just like us, but that's not the range of intelligence. We don't know how many thousand other potential ways, from pulsating silica sheets to Lord knows what, could yield intelligence. Until we know that, we can't even answer the issue of convergibility. So we're stuck. It's the most interesting question you can ask, and there's virtually nothing of scientific import that you can say about it, but we can't stop talking about it because it's too interesting.
Okay.
with our increasing understanding of the human genome, there arises the possibility of the human species actually controlling perhaps our own evolution. Do you have any insights into this possibility?
Well, clearly it could happen. I don't feel I have any great insight. When Paul challenged us earlier today to say something about futures, what I wanted to say to him is I think he's half right. That is, we must take on the moral challenge of outlining the kind of world we want, but I think it's nothing but foolishness to make actual projections about what it'll be like in 20 or 50 years, because if the world shows us anything, it's the arrogance of thinking you can predict that gets you into trouble. Those curves are not extrapolatable. They're determined by social and political factors that even people who devoted their lives to social and political studies can't begin to answer. This poor paleontologist isn't going to come close to any expertise on that. So I don't know what to say to that, except that, and I'll tell you why. See, the thing is, certainly we're going to have that technical capacity. It's a feedback of Lamarckian cultural evolution, which has led to our understanding of genomics, of Lamarckian cultural change upon biological knowledge, because we can now input this incredibly rapid Lamarckian system. That is, well, I'm saying that metaphorically, and I'm getting too far. Let me unwind that, because that's too mixed a metaphor. The point is, our Lamarckian cultural scientific progress has taught us to do these kind of things, which now can input to alter genomic evolution in a way that could never happen naturally. So yes, we will be able to do such things, but what we're going to do, and a lot of it is morally very dubious, is largely a question of social and political histories more than it is of genomics, and I have no way of predicting what those are going to be, except that I hope we will remain very vigilant about potential misuses. Any technological power like that has uses on both sides. That's pap, but I don't know what else to say. I'll take these 4 more, and that's all. So the folks, no, stay there. No, the folks who are there. No, you're good. Come back. Come back. The folks who are there, I'll take. Yeah, okay.
First of all, I wanted to congratulate you on completion of your 300 essays.
Thank you.
And to thank you, because I've really enjoyed reading them. My question is about contingency and your experience in trying to defend your statements about contingency. I was trained as a physicist, and one of the most successful theories in physics, of course, is quantum mechanics, and someone of the stature of Einstein rejected it on the basis of it's not contingency built into the theory, saying that God does not play dice. You didn't mention the controversy surrounding your book, Wonderful Life, and contingency surrounding that. I wonder if you wanted to...
Do you want a longer talk?
Well, yes, now that you mention it.
Repeat your own question. I don't believe in repeating questions. In a shorter version.
The question is, is contingency so fundamentally against what we are as humans that people are always going to have a difficult time accepting that things are not deterministic or predictable in advance?
Well, I hope not. I mean, on the issue of no, I hope we can encompass that. We've encompassed bigger philosophical shifts just in Western history. No, with respect to the Burgess Shale issue, when Simon Conway Morris wrote this book, Crucible of Creation, which argues against my contingentist interpretation of the Burgess Shale, I don't know what to say except that I disagree with him. Certainly some of those creatures that, when I wrote the book, were simply unexplained in terms of their taxonomic placement. I mean, Simon's own hallucigenia turns out to be a member of the phylum Onychophora because he'd interpreted it in an inverted fashion, and that's fine, that's terrific. But just as many strange ones remain unexamined and uncontended. It's in terms of the technical debate about that. Even our strongest opponents trying to quantify the disparity of arthropods at the time of the Burgess Shale come out with a figure that allows that already, by the time the Burgess Shale was 10 million years after the Cambrian explosion, that arthropod disparity, that is anatomical range, had already reached the full range of modern arthropod disparity. In other words, even they admit that in 500 million years, 530 million years, there's been no increase of the anatomical range of arthropod. Now, we happen to think that it was further out in the Burgess Shale and has come in some. So that's something really strange happened in the Cambrian explosion. I think it's pretty clear any way you want to look at it, and that there were other choices not taken, I think is also pretty clear. But, yeah.
This is a question that's inspired by reading Rocks of Ages in me. I'm thinking how there's a significant number of people in society that do deeply care about the fullness of life on our planet and don't fear that we are deeply connected with the other species on our planet.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And yet they may not be very scientifically based. They may be rather distrustful of an activity they see as commercialism or militarism and don't see the kind of folks we see here today, who I don't tend to think of that way at all. I'm wondering if you've seen examples, or we can think of ones in the world where we're seeing those barriers breaking down. People like gathered today, staying in touch, and collectively going and breaking down the barriers and linking up with people who have similar values but perhaps aren't skeptical or scientifical minded as much. I know that's a tough one.
Oh, yeah, again, I mean, I'm an ecumenical and irenic fellow at heart. My main personal interests, however, are not in that kind of, I think, what the vernacular political language calls bridge building. But I think it is awfully important. There are many people in the religious community, for example, who for different reasons grounded in ethical beliefs, or even in their view about what superior humans as stewards of this planet should do, which I think is a position that's almost offensive to me in terms of what I think the meaning of human life represents. On the other hand, it's entirely well-meaning and leads to some similar conclusions, and I would happy to be a bedfellow of folks if we can work on similar environmental issues together. So no, I appreciate that suggestion. I think there are groups that try, and there are many groups now in every major religion that are trying to explore, particularly on environmental and ecological questions, issues of common ground, of which there are many. Yeah, two more.
Okay, first I have a brief comment and then a question. The comment is your remark about the apples not hanging suspended in the sky while we wait for the theory of gravity. I mentioned that one time to a student of mine. She said, but that's different. That's the law of gravity.
Oh, no. I mean,
No.
That's a sort of vernacular language. It's kind of
Yeah.
funny. I mean, we tend to use the word law when something's quantifiable and sounds more exact. I mean, is natural selection a law? It's not quantifiable in the same sense, but I don't see why not. Yeah.
Exactly, and I was
Yeah, I think
sharing
that's
that as a joke.
terminology.
I do get it. But the other one is, and I think I'm remembering this allusion correctly, when you mentioned Duchamp, I had this thought, gee, there may be some sort of interesting connections between your wife Rhonda's work on Duchamp, if I'm remembering correctly what it was, and your own work. I'm thinking particularly intelligent design, and I'm just wondering if...
What?
Am I remembering?
I didn't get the last point about intelligent design.
Oh, okay, well, am I remembering correctly, about Rhonda, about your work about Duchamp's urinal? Was that you?
Yeah, but what's the...
Okay, well, I guess I'll try and do a quick summary of what I remember. You discovered, if I remember correctly, that what people thought was a ready-made urinal of Duchamp's, he'd actually built it himself.
All right,
and
but give me the connection to the
Okay,
question.
and so what appeared to be just a urinal that was out there in the world was actually created through the intelligent design of Duchamp. And
Okay.
I was wondering if either of you had made those connections or had any thoughts on
But
it,
that's-
for what it's worth.
I don't know what to make of that. That's necessarily true because humans are conscious agents who do things for purposes, and no one's ever denied old-fashioned teleology, at least because
Yeah,
humans
and-
have intentions, some of which are unconscious to be sure. The issue with respect to what I've been discussing tonight is not that, which of course we accept if the ready-mades were not taken off store shelves but are actually cleverly modified to varying degrees by Duchamp, then he did it for a reason, which may be fairly arcane, which we're struggling to understand. But I can't transfer any of that into the catchphrase intelligent design as it's used by some of our creationist friends trying to get a little more respectable, because the problem is, it's always been the problem since Darwin. I mean, the heart of Darwin's revolution is that there doesn't seem to be out there. There may be spiritual powers that science can't understand, but there doesn't seem to be an anthropocentric agent who has purpose that he's imposed upon the earth in recognizable human terms. And the fact that you tell me that humans do it, which I always knew, isn't going to transfer at all into any implications for what's
let me
out there.
clarify. This one was really sort of a joke, too, and I wanted to just show off that I knew about that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Good evening. This one may be easier, may not. Assuming we take you at your word that this December issue in Natural History will be your last of the monthly article.
Oh, yes, it is.
But also...
I don't want to be like the aging operatic diva making a sixth farewell tour. No way. I don't know how many. Marian Anderson was a great woman, but she made a lot of farewell to us.
But then also citing your confession today that it's a selfish act to write. Can you contain that selfishness in periodic books, or will we see it?
Oh, I didn't say I stopped writing. I'm just not going to write monthly essays for natural history. No, I can't stop writing. It'd be like stopping breathing. I didn't mean for you to take. I mean, that's when I'll stop writing. You know, when the angel of death makes his most unwelcome but inevitable intrusion. But or if senility happens to intervene first, but which I trust it won't. No, of course I won't stop.
No, the question was, would you just limit yourself to the book, or could we expect to maybe find your work between the pages of Natural History or other magazines?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm just not going to write monthly essays for natural history. You may even see me in natural history once in a while. Just won't be every month.
Very good.
But thank you for asking. Yeah.